time for another book versus adaptation, where I watch the adaptation, then read the book, and decide which is better based on the plot, characters, and relationships. If you've ever loved a book but dreaded watching the adaptation, or maybe you're curious which one you should watch first, then this video will be for you. In this video, we're talking about what My Lady Jane, the book, did best, where the show surprised us, and most importantly, which one had one crucial element that was missing? Can you guess which one? Let's dive in and decide which My Lady Jane deserves the crown. Let the showdown begin! There will be spoilers for the book and the adaptation in this video, so if you don't want to be spoiled, then feel free to use the chapters in the description box below to skip to my overall thoughts. For those of you that are new here, I'm Steph, a lover of all things stories with a particular passion for book adaptations. My Lady Jane is a young adult historical fantasy by 3 authors whose names I can never remember, so I'm just going to read them off for you. Cynthia Hand, Brody Ashton, and Jody Meadows. The TV show is available on Amazon Prime to watch. Sadly, it has been canceled after the first season. There is an effort to try to save the show, and if you're interested in signing the fans petition for that, you can click the link in the description box below. And I'm supporting this petition because I'd really like to see a second season, and we'll get into why a little bit later. So if you're not familiar with the historical aspect of Lady Jane Grey, Lady Jane Grey actually succeeded King Edward VI, which was Henry VIII's son, after Edward died, and she ruled for 9 days before she was beheaded and dethroned by Mary, or as a lot of people know her today, Bloody Mary. My Lady Jane takes things in a different direction. So this is set in a world where instead of the major Catholic versus Protestant, you have Athenians versus Verities, and Athenians are shapeshifters. And in this story, Jane is Edward's best friend, and after some conniving by her recent husband's father, who is an advisor to Edward, Edward decides to name Jane Grey's heirs as his successors because he does not want Mary to take the throne. Alright, so let's dive into what I thought about the plot or story overall. Here's what I think was better in the book. All joking aside, it's not that the book was terrible. I just don't think the book was for me. I am definitely not the target audience of this book. It's very kind of traditional YA, which I do like YA, and this is a book that I would have inhaled when I was 12. So in that way, this book does market to its target audience really well. However, after seeing the show first, I was really surprised because while they both had kind of that irreverent tone that the narrators give you.
What if history were different?
Never do anything you don't want to do.
My Lady Jane, the show, is definitely for adults. Also, this book, for what it was really long. The show really only goes to the midpoint of this book that kind of covers the 9 days that Jane is in power. We don't really know how many days she's in power in the show, but historically we know that she was in power for 9 days. Here's what I think was better in the show. The conflict versus the Athenians and Verities was so intriguing to me in the show. I think it does a really great job of kind of examining the Catholic and Protestant conflict of the time in a way that isn't quite as real or personal to people even today, 500 years later. I really enjoy that they made Mary the primary villain in the TV show, whereas in the book, the primary villain is Gifford's father. Also, overall in the show, I think the family dynamics for Jane and for Gifford were more interesting. Jane has her mother in the book, but she doesn't carry the weight that the character has in the show. Teddy bear. I hear you. Can I help you, sir? Hi. And honestly, the relationship with Gifford and his father and his brother is one of my favorite parts of the TV show, and I was shocked that all of that depth from their relationships was just gone in the book. Technically, it was never there in the first place and they added it into the show, but you get what I mean. Next, let's talk about characters. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on the 3 point of view characters from the book. So of course, first we have Jane. I found it really interesting that in the book, Jane is Ethian. I did not see that coming at all. And maybe the show would have gotten there eventually, but I kind of liked that she wasn't because it added some interesting tension and conflict between her and Gifford, which I'll talk more about that in the relationship section of this video. Jane in the book is also a lot more passive. And the one thing I'll say about Jane from the show is she definitely cared about what was going on. The other thing I really appreciated is the way they built up the tension to Jane being replaced in the show, in the fact that Jane was really trying to make changes that she never tries to make in the book. She says that it would be great, but then when she has the power to actually do something, she doesn't. Now, in the show, Jane says, I have the power to do something, I'm gonna do it, she does it, and then she gets dethroned. So maybe Jane in the book was right in that instance, but I still preferred the Jane in the show because she was more proactive. Gifford is also very different between the book and the show. At least at the beginning, you do get from the show that kind of laissez-faire, chill kind of guy, doesn't care about anything, kind of privileged persona that Gifford in the book has. And don't get me wrong, I love me a nerd hero. I live for it. That's who I would pick in real life. And I remembered kind of like really not liking Gifford at first in the show because he was that typical leading man of like, I'm the rock star who can beguile women, which is like the persona Gifford in the book is trying to make people think while he's going off to poetry readings. I also really appreciated that in the show, Gifford didn't want to be king. He never wanted to be king. He actively fought his father. Well, okay. He didn't actively fight his father on it, but he definitely was not in agreement with what his father wanted. Whereas in the book, it's not that Gifford wanted to be king, but there was definitely this mentality, which I think they were trying to show like the male mentality that might have existed at the time. But honestly, you threw every other historical thing out the window for these books. Why did you have to leave the misogyny? Where he basically said, it's not that I wanted to be king, but I didn't think that you wouldn't let me have it. And that's just kind of my problem with Gifford in the book overall, is just the immense amount of privilege. I also think the show added a lot of depth to Gifford's character by making his inability to control his transformation rooted in trauma versus just his desire.
If therapists were invented in 1553, our brooding, tortured hero would be a different man, and this would be a different story.
I think it makes him a more relatable character, even if it is a bit cliche, poor, tortured, dark hero, woe is me. As opposed to, again, the reason why he can't control his change in the book is just he doesn't want to. And it also gives him something he has to work through outside of his relationship with Jane, whereas the book, their transformations are rooted in them just wanting to be together, which is cute, and like, don't get me wrong, I love me a Lady Hawk type trope, but I preferred the weightier story. Now let's talk about Edward. Obviously, I love that they chose to add diversity with the freaking King of England. Although, did you have to put all of your diversity in one character? Aside from the obvious, the biggest change in Edward between the book and the show is that they made him gay, which I'm not going to complain about. But they also made him an Ethian, which I kind of missed. Again, like, I understand why they didn't do it in the show because they were really trying to create more of that tension between Ethians and Verities, and if your king is an Ethian, well then, where does this conflict come from? But at the end of the day, Edward in the book felt kind of useless, whereas at least they made Edward a good fighter in the show.
Amusing story, actually. I was always sickly.
Alright, now let's talk about relationships, and while there are a lot more relationships than what I'm going to focus on, again, I'm kind of just focusing on our 3 POV characters and how the changes between the book and the show affected the story. So let's start with Jane and Edward. I absolutely loved their friendship in the show, and you do get that in the book, but because Edward isn't gay in the book, it's definitely insinuated that Edward has romantic feelings for her, and that the only reason he didn't marry her himself is because he thought he was dying. And I will say there was also a lot more tension between Jane and Edward in the show because of Edward forcing her into a marriage that she doesn't want. Whereas Jane in the book is probably a little bit more historically accurate in that she doesn't really want to marry someone that's arranged, but she's also like, this is my role in society. Whereas that is not the Jane in the show. Let's talk about Edward and Gifford. So I can't even remember if Edward was at Jane's wedding in the show, but I'm trying to remember if Edward and Gifford ever meet in the show, and to be fair, it's been a minute since I watched the show, but I don't remember them ever meeting, and that's kind of sad because I loved their friendship in the book. I mean, the conversation that Edward has with Gifford before the wedding where he's basically like, you better treat her right, I absolutely loved that, and I don't understand why they couldn't have had that in the show. Now, I may need to go and rewatch right before the wedding just to make sure they didn't actually have that scene. And then because they do end up reuniting, you do get to see their friendship develop, and I felt a little cheated out of that from the show. And of course, our pivotal relationship, Jane and Gifford. I mean, don't get me wrong, their romance in the book was cute and perfectly age appropriate and just kind of sweet. However, the reveal at the wedding in the show is probably one of my favorite moments in television for a really long time. Their relationship also has a lot more animosity in the show, and they do a good job of explaining the reasons why there's animosity, but also that there's this like very underlying sexual tension. So my phone ran out of space, so if you notice a different camera angle, hopefully it's a better one than what I already filmed, that would be why. Yes, so where was I? Overall, Jane and Gifford's animosity in the book comes off pretty shallow and is all miscommunication based, whereas in the show, they have legitimate problems that honestly Jane should have had in the book and didn't. Yeah, Jane in the show, her initial reaction to marrying Gifford is,
Guilford Dudley. I've heard of him. The girls at court say he's vile. He drinks, fights, gambles. He cavorts with women of ill repute. He's the last man I would ever marry.
Whereas in the book, that's the primary conflict between them, is that she thinks Gifford is one way and then has to find out he's not, which is sweet for an arranged marriage trope. But again, the fact that a lot of the tension in their relationship stemmed from the Ethan and Verity conflict just added all this delicious drama. And the fact that a lot of what Gifford's father was doing was to protect Gifford because he was Ethian, it just added so much more depth and weight to their interactions and their relationship. Because not only does Jane have to learn to love an Ethian, but Gifford also has to learn to love himself too. And that's just a much more satisfying journey, in my opinion. I mean, Jane in the book isn't even really that upset that Gifford is an Ethian at all. She's like, oh, well, maybe you should have told me before I married you, but okay. Whereas Jane in the show is like, you're Ethian? Oh no, if people find out, we're all gonna die. So I knew nothing about Lady Jane Grey before going into this book versus adaptation. So I actually had to do a little bit of research because I thought Mary succeeded Edward pretty much immediately. I didn't realize that there was someone in between there. And when I was watching the show, the fantasy element of it completely took me by surprise. I mean, I was already kind of surprised by the tone, but since I had watched Catherine the Great, which has a very kind of similar irreverent tone, it didn't take me that long to get used to. But the fantasy element, by the time they added the shapeshifters, I was like, yes, I am here for this. And after finishing the show, which was spicy, quite spicy, I was kind of curious to see if the book was as spicy. It wasn't. And that does give me a lot of questions about why Amazon decided to add all of this spice to a very honestly like clean YA book. And if I had to break it down, it's like this. The people who initially read My Lady Jane Grey are older now. 1, sex sells. And 2, I think this might have been their way to try to capitalize off of the romantasy trend that's going on in a lot of book spaces right now. I say that as a romantasy lover. But that being said, I don't necessarily appreciate spice being added just for spice's sake. Before I tell you which one I liked better, let me know, have you seen the adaptation or read the book? What did you think? Which did you like better? Let me know in the comments. So I don't think you're surprised that I preferred the show overall. And the crucial element that was missing from the book that I mentioned at the beginning of this video for me was the tension. The book just didn't have any tension. There were no stakes. And when you're talking about the political rulers of one of the most powerful nations in history, stakes are important. That being said, I imagine that if you're a fan of the book, you're probably not going to like this adaptation because it is so different. At the end of the day, if you like amped up political drama and maybe you want some spice, I'd recommend the show. If you want something clean and sweet and kind of cozy, I'd recommend the book. Let's see what stories tomorrow brings. Oh, my nose itches.